Uh, I think the next question on the list was, what are the best ways to use Gita to develop oneself? So this is also a very important question, you know, because people see Bhagavad Gita from many different angles, you know. One thing very commonly we hear when people say, well, you know, whenever I have any problem, I I refer to Bhagavad Gita. You know, I turn to Bhagavad Gita and I feel that it solves my problem. Now, you know, that kind of a statement is a very, very broad statement. So, you know, if I want a recipe for sambar, I can't read Bhagavad Gita. It's not going to give me. Okay. There are a million things which Bhagavad Gita doesn't talk about, you know, pertaining to our life, pertaining to the world, how we live, and so on, you know. So there are certain things that Bhagavad Gita talks about. It has a subject matter, you know. So what it will give me depends on what is the subject matter, you know, where Bhagavad Gita is concerned. So that is something to keep in mind, you know. What is it that Gita is trying to tell us is the thing to first understand, you know, so that when I look at it, I'm approaching it in the right way, you know. So Bhagavad Gita is called Moksha Shastram. It is a means to gain a certain end in life called as moksha. And how we understand what moksha is, that's also important, you know. So as human beings, we find ourselves limited in so many ways. We feel this sense of limitations, you know. We are limited as individuals, living in a world which seems limitless. And so it's overwhelming just in terms of understanding it and knowing how to interact with the world in a way that makes us comfortable, that makes us happy, that makes us content. That's really what we are all looking for. So, this sense of limitation is something that never goes away. In spite of what we do, it seems to always be there. You know. We never find a sense of total fulfillment or freedom from this particular sense inside of discomfort. Different degrees of discomfort. You know, it may be simple discomfort in certain things, or it may be a big problem also with suffering and sorrow and pain and like that. So, is there a way to get free? What is the nature of this freedom, this sense of limitation? Can it be overcome for a human being, or can it not be overcome? What is the nature of myself? What is the nature of the world? What is my connection with it? All these are questions that underlie this sense of limitation. And this is what scripture, this is something I can't figure out. By thinking about it doesn't make me free. Doing many things, all kinds of things, also doesn't seem to make me gain that freedom. So, is it even possible? And if it is possible, then why is this sense of limitation there? How am I going to overcome it? All those kinds of things are what we call a pursuit, a spiritual pursuit, you know, finding an answer, finding a resolution for these kinds of questions. And since we are not able to figure this out ourselves, there is a means that is provided, that is available to us. And that means is in the form of this knowledge, the spiritual knowledge that is given to us by the scripture, by our scriptures. And this knowledge, this there is a body of knowledge. This is the subject. This is the subject matter. So I need to know this so that I can recognize these these truths about myself. And the means to recognize it is by listening to or looking at what the scriptures have to tell us and trying to understand it, what it takes to understand that also. In order to understand anything in life, it takes certain things. It takes some common sense, it takes some maturity, it takes a certain kind of a mind. So all those things also I have to know. So these are all what become the subject matter of the study of our scripture. The idea is that I need to know these fundamental truths about myself and about the world, and I don't have any other means to know it, really speaking, to get to that myself, my inner self, my true self. And so this scripture is said to be the source of this knowledge. So I look at it and I try to understand it. And to understand anything, any subject matter, so there's a way in which it is presented. Here it is in the form of a language, any communication, because it's communication. Scripture is trying to communicate something to me, the individual. So it uses a language. So what kind of a language? Of words? By language, I mean in a general sense, a language of words. And words have meanings. That is how we know things. So, or we know things by our senses, like eyes, ears, all our different sense perceptions. That is one way to know. I see things, I hear things, I smell things. Another way to know is by words, by knowledge. There is somebody who already knows, and that person then tells me, communicates that to me through words, and then I listen to it. And now I have to understand the language. Suppose somebody talks to me in a language which I don't know, then I'm not going to understand anything. So here the language is also not just words. I may know the words, I may know the simple meaning of the words, but then words also have a lot of meanings. Sometimes one word has many different meanings. So what meaning, that each meaning applies in a different context. So I have to know, I have to learn how to understand which meaning applies in which context. Not only that, there is another way also in the language. For example, the language of computers. If you're reading a book on instructions for a computer that is written in English, and you know English, you know all the words, meanings, and then you also have a dictionary with you. This is the first time you're reading a book on computers. You don't know anything about a computer. Now you read a book, the instructions it came with, and then it says so many things. It uses words. Words like hard drive, soft drive, upload, download, scroll. All kinds of these words are used. Application, soft copy, hard copy. Now, these are all simple words in English. You know the meaning of hard, soft, you know the meaning of upload, you know the meaning of, all these words, you know the meaning. But that doesn't help you operate the computer or understand what they are talking about, you know, because they use the words with special meanings. They're attributed with special meanings, which only apply to computers, not to anything else. You know, then you have to know that also. So similarly, in a scripture like Bhagavad Gita or any of our scriptures, words are used. Words are in Sanskrit, let us say, or any other language. You can have a translation of Bhagavad Gita in a language that you know, but they also are used in a special sense. They have Atma, the word Atma. The word Atma has different meanings contextually. So I have to know, first of all, I have to know what Atma means exactly. Then I have to know what it means in a given context. I have to understand the context. So, this is how we understand a language. Only then we know what it's trying to say. And we get the proper understanding. Otherwise, what happens? We put our own meaning because we know the words. Because you know the word, then we already have an idea of what it means. And that may be right, that may be wrong, that may be right, but out of context, it may be wrong. So, without imputing our own meaning to the words, I really have to look at these words fresh, like in computers. When you say hard drive, soft drive, somebody says this, then I have to now look at it as though I never heard of this before. And here, what does it mean here in this case? So when I look at the question is, what is the best way to use it? I would say, what is the best way to approach it? First, this is the first most important thing in approaching a scripture like Bhagavad Gita. The first approach is that let me look at what it is saying, the words it uses in a fresh way. And fortunately, it's not like a instruction sheet of a computer. They just give it to you. You have to figure it out. Or you have to ask somebody. You know. Here, the whole scriptural teaching in our tradition, at least, is such that as we study, you know, with some teacher, which is what you're doing, you're reading Bhagavad Gita home study program. You're not just reading Bhagavad Gita text. You're actually sitting in a classroom where everything is being explained, all the words are being explained, the context is given, and what it means, all those things are there. So that is when knowledge takes place. The proper thing, proper knowledge. I understand things in a proper way. So that is how one needs to approach any scripture, including Bhagavad Gita. And that is how we use it. That is how scripture is a means. It's a means to get us to a point where we have clarity, we have not knowledge. And so, as you will see, as you're seeing while you're reading, everything gets explained in terms of what is the purpose of this Gita, what do you get out of it, through the eyes of a student, Arjuna. So there is a context here, there is a teacher, there is a student, and the student wants to know. And he has a lot of problems, he has a lot of questions, he keeps asking for clarity. And Sri Krishna is teaching him, giving him this knowledge. So you have to I put myself in the position of a student and then try to understand what Sri Krishna is telling me. That is how we use Bhagavad Gita. That is how it becomes a source of knowledge and a means also by which one gains the knowledge. So I hope that answers that particular question. Is Gita, if you have any doubts that come up, just make a note of it. Last towards the end we can go over them. Is Gita a summary of all Upanishads? Well, yes and no. Okay. In the sense, a summary is something where you take, suppose you take the Upanishad. I take an Upanishad, Katha Upanishad. And Katha Upanishad says certain things. And I tell it to you in a brief form, what it tells. The story, there is a story there. So there is a teaching. And I summarize that for you. That's a summary. So Bhagavad Gita is not a summary of Upanishads like that. There are so many Upanishads. It doesn't summarize. You take any one chapter, it doesn't summarize any particular Upanishad. Altogether also, it doesn't summarize anything, Upanishad-wise. But at the same time, it has something to say. It conveys a knowledge. That knowledge that is there in Bhagavad Gita is the same knowledge that is there in the Upanishads. Okay. So the subject matter is the same. The subject matter of the Bhagavad Gita is the subject matter of the Upanishads also. Basically, the subject matter has to do with the individual, the world, Bhagavan, and the connection between all of this. And for that how to know the knowledge connected to that, how to recognize that connections in ourselves, and the different means that are required in order to understand that in terms of our mind. All that called sadhanams, all those things are told in Upanishads. And the same subject, same matter is also revealed to us in Bhagavad Gita. Nothing different. Knowledge is the same. But it's given in a little different way, with a different context. So, it is not a summary of the Upanishads, but at the same time, it has the same subject matter that the Upanishads teaches, the Bhagavad Gita also teaches. Some verses in Bhagavad Gita sometimes are taken from the Upanishad. So those verses are sometimes just transported, or the same verses are referenced or quoted. So, next one. What is the difference between roles like father, mother, and duty? So a role is a role, A role is something that is there in a given context. So as a person, I'm an individual, but then, I'm a complex individual. And there are different situations in life that I have to deal with. I come in contact with different people, different environments, different circumstances, different events. Things happen. So when things happen, I have to go to work, I have to go to school. So in each situation, there are certain things that I'm called upon to do. I have to relate in a certain way. So in relation to my children, in relation to my family, in relation to my job, in relation to my neighbors. So different situations call upon me to interact, relate in different ways. So these are what are called as roles. Role is who I am or what I am that I have to play, a role I put forth, that is decided based on the circumstance and the relationship. That is what is called as a role. So, as an individual, I have different roles because I have different situations, different relationships, different circumstances. I'm a father to somebody, I'm a mother to somebody. I'm not a father to the whole world. I'm not a son to the whole world. So, these different roles I play, but I'm the same person. So, this is what is called as a role. What I have to do in a role, a role defines what I have to do, what I'm expected to do. In my role as an employer, there are certain expectations from me. In my role as a father, there are certain expectations from me. There are certain responsibilities I have that I need to fulfill. And who defines those responsibilities? Who tells me, who decided I should take care of my child? Who decided? Did I decide it? Did my spouse decide? Does my neighbor decide? Who decides? Well, really speaking, it's the role that decides, because that is how it is. That is what is duty. Okay. It's not like preference. There's no preference. So there are varieties of duties we are supposed to, that are called upon for us to do, that are expected, that need to be done also. They're not just simple expectations out of preference, but those are expectations because that is what is necessary and good for me also, for my growth, for my well being. So, those things fall under the category of duty. So, duties are defined by the roles that we have in life. Not everybody is a father. Suppose somebody doesn't have children, then they don't have any duties as a parent because they don't have a child, they don't have a progeny. So, like that. So, roles and duty. We play many, many roles, and each role comes with certain duties. Okay. There's a whole few questions are there connected to page 7. So, dharma and all. Security, artha, kama, dharma, purusharthas. So, one is, can ego security in the form of doing charity work be artha? So, there are 4 terms used in purusharthas: artha, kama, dharma, and moksha. When you say security, when we talk of security, we are using it in the sense of secure and insecure. So, as a person, suppose, for example, money. So, I need to have money in order to live. And then money can be, so it can be I need money to survive because I have to eat and so on. Without food, I'll die. So, there is money to survive. There is money that keeps me certain standard of living. I need money for enjoyment. I need money but then what happens? Suppose I'm not able to go to work. Then what am I going to do if I don't have money? So then I feel insecure about that. So I want to feel now secure. So what's going to happen if I cannot go to work? And so then somebody says, oh, you should start saving money. So now I need more money. So for saving, because that is going to give me security. So now I save certain money, I feel more secure. That okay, even if I don't work for a year or 2 years, I'll be okay. I can still survive. Then I start worrying about my children. So what's going to happen if they have a problem? Then, okay, no, then I feel insecure again. Then I want some more money. And so then for that, then I feel more secure because they are going to be happy. They are going to be comfortable. So this is what is meant by security and insecurity. Anything that I feel is inadequate, not enough, makes me feel insecure, whether it is in terms of finance, whether it could be health, it could be relationships. I'll be alone. I have no friends. I have nobody. So these kinds of things. So we have different kinds of things in us as an individual that I feel insecure about. And then I do different things in order that make me feel more secure. Okay. Let's forget the word ego security. If you use the word ego security, means then you mean something by ego. We have to say, what exactly you mean by ego? When somebody says ego security, I'm saying security. There are all kinds of security and insecurity. So now, artha is when I want to seek certain things in life that I feel not secure about, in terms of objects, in terms of money, in terms of things, in terms of relationships. Things, objects, those are called as arthas. Then this is one type of pursuit in life. We pursue different kinds of arthas, each of which makes us feel more secure in that particular area. Then there is another kind of pursuit which is not just related to artha, but this is so kama, or so desires, things that make me feel good, make me feel happy. It may not involve much money, or things, no, it may not involve objects also. I want to see something. I have not met my friend for a long time. I miss that person. Then I meet my friend. I feel happy. So we have different desires in us. And those desires are not necessarily connected to objects, acquiring objects. They're not acquisitions. They're not based on acquisition. They're more based on just experience. I'm meeting somebody and so on, going to the temple. I want to visit this place. I want to visit this place. I go visit that place. I feel good. It may be down the street. There is no acquisition here, but it's an experience. So these are called karmas, different desires which I fulfill that make me feel also good, happy. Now I can go about doing things in life as a human being in a way that is right or wrong. Then when right and wrong become an issue, then that brings in dharma there. Because dharma means right and wrong. Human beings have to deal with this right and wrong issue, which other animals don't have to deal with. So that is what is called as dharma. That is another pursuit. And the last pursuit is called as moksha, which is what I explained before. This feeling limited, etc., for which I turn to some spiritual source of knowledge, the scripture. That is what is called as moksha pursuit. So these are the different kinds of pursuit. Now, charity work. What is charity work? So charity is when I'm giving something. Is charity, right? It can be something giving tangible in terms of goods, things, objects, money, or charity. It can be also giving Giving time, giving attention is another kind of giving. So now the question is, what is the purpose of my giving? Am I giving so like an investment so that later on I can get back something? What is my motivation? Am I giving because I just makes me feel happy? Am I giving because somebody needs it? Am I giving because that's the right thing to do? So there are different motivations. So motivations are what actually make a difference. Giving is always good. There is something good about giving. But then what the more beyond that, it depends on what motivates a person to give. That is also where right, wrong, and all come in. So that is how these pursuits are interconnected. So charity work depends on why one is doing it. Whether it is doing it for a particular artha or doing it for kama or doing it for dharma sake. So that's the motivation. Two, some people do charity work and other good deeds to feed their ego, derive pleasure. What kind of security is this? Ego security. See, this ego security's word is not there in these four pursuits. Unless I don't know what it means exactly. I don't, whoever asked the question, if you say that it is just, oh, it's just to feel good, ego security means just feeling good, makes me feel good. So then again, the four types of pursuits are there, all of which can make me feel good. But the motivation is what would make the differences. As to how you want to categorize. It doesn't really matter how you categorize it. Artha kama are the pursuits everybody, even animals have artha kama. They also want security, they want to shelter, they store food, there are things that make them feel good, there are things that don't make them feel good. So they also want to do certain things, they don't want to do certain things. But it's all about motivation. They don't have right and wrong, and they don't have moksha as a goal. That's all. This. So, okay. We do everything which makes us feel good. Nobody does anything which makes them feel bad. So even when I do for somebody else, I do because it makes me feel good. So that is always there as the foundation of it. If doing for others made me feel bad, then I would not do. So ultimately, we all do things which make us feel good. And right things make us feel good too. That's why we do them. From dharma standpoint. Okay, next question. Dharma as a human end says that dharma is when you're able to relieve someone's suffering, you experience a joy that is not karma. But what if this person goes around telling everyone about the good he or she has done? Is this not ego boosting? Is it not karma? Yeah, it is karma in the sense, like I said, it is all the motivation is what determines what category you want to put in. You know, I can do good for somebody else and feel good about it. Okay, just the doing part of it. Then I go about talking about it, which actually makes me feel better. Well, now I'm recognized for what I did. Makes me feel better. So the first part is okay. The second part, You know, it depends what the motivation is. For what reason I'm going and doing that. So it all depends on that. Is dharma more like unconditional love or unconditional acts? See, the word dharma has to do with right and wrong. Okay. Really, it's simple. Dharma is right and wrong. So we need not get into this unconditional love and all connected to dharma. It's not necessary. Selfless acts in the sense when the motivation is primarily not for my own sake, yeah, primarily. On some level, it is always for me because it makes me feel good. Okay. Even when I do for others, there is no absolute unselfish thing. You know, if selfish means for oneself, then anything we do is for oneself because it makes one feel good. You know, in a broad sense. Yeah. Does moksha mean having no more needs? Sometimes people say they attain moksha during deep meditation. How does this relate to the moksha explained here? Having no more needs. Again, you know, there are a lot of needs we have on different levels. I have need for air, breathing. I have need for food. So there are these basic needs are there, fundamental needs are there, survival needs are there. Then there are other needs which are things that have to be done. Then there are needs connected to my personal preferences and choices. I need a car. I need a job. I need a house. Then there are needs are connected to luxuries. There are all kinds of needs. So when you say having no more needs, moksha means now the person doesn't need anything. There is no such thing like that in an absolute sense. Even a person gain moksha. We are talking about now, we have to also understand these words. What do you mean by moksha? So when suppose a person is there, they got moksha, they are still there. So now what do you mean when you say they don't have any needs? They have survival needs. They still need to breathe. They still need to eat. If they feel sick, they need to take aspirin. They may need to go to the doctor. So it's all at different levels. But remember in the beginning what I said, this sense of feeling inadequate, incomplete, limited, unhappy of a human being. There is a spiritual need. There is a spiritual need on a level which doesn't make me feel fulfilled, tranquil, happy, at peace with myself, content with myself. In spite of all these other things which I have and I don't have, I have, that kind of a need that is there in every human being, that is not there when a person has moksha. One finds contentment whether you get the food one morning or you don't, whether it is tasty or it's not tasty. It's not a big thing. Not a big thing. You don't lose your temper because the food is not tasty, But is there a need for food? There is a need for food because the need for food is very fundamental as long as you're alive. So, but there is no need for South Indian food or North Indian food, that kind of a stuff. So, okay. So this is one set of questions we have finished actually. Then there were some recent questions. Uh, okay, which again, there are 3, 4 questions here. I'll read them all out because they are kind of connected to each other. So then I'll explain. If one is, if Atma is unchanging and unaffected by the actions carried out by the physical self, then why is there reincarnation, law of karma? Why doesn't the effects of the physical body and mind's karma end when the particular body's life ends? If Atma is forever fresh and unchanged and part of Paramatma, then why do we have to go through the cycle of life? Why did Paramatma Ishvara create us? 3. If Atma is unaffected, unchanged, then what carries the karma after the physical body dies? 4. If Atma never grows and is forever unchanged, then why do some humans appear more enlightened than others? Why some are jnanis or saints, like Shankara, and others are murderers? So, this question, all these questions are connected to Atma. Words like Atma, Jiva, this is one thing. So, we need to be clear about what these words mean. I mean, that's really what the whole teaching is all about. The whole teaching is teaching about Atma, getting to know the Atma. This was Arjuna's issue in the whole Bhagavad Gita. In fact, that is the subject matter of the whole Bhagavad Gita, is what is the nature of Atma and how does one get to recognize, because Atma means oneself. And when it says oneself, what do we mean by the oneself? Does it refer to the physical body? Does it refer to the mind? Does it refer to my cognitive thinking capacity? Does it refer to the brain? What is it referring to? So who's the person who dies? Does the body die? Does the Atma die? Who dies? Does anything survive after we die? Does the body survive? Does the Atma survive? What do you mean by survive? These are all the subject matter of the text. So this is all going to come. This question comes because he mentions, that Atma doesn't die. Na jayate mriyate va kadachit. He's explaining in the second chapter, he's making statements. Bhagavan made certain statements. Atma doesn't die. The body dies. Like these statements are made. But how that is so is not yet explained. Scripture says certain things. Then it explains them. So sometimes these kinds of questions one needs to wait before you find out what it is saying and then ask. So in the beginning, what happens in the second chapter, Arjuna, remember, he's very anxious. He's very anxious. And his biggest problem was at that moment that he was going to kill all these people. You know, he was not worried that he would be killed. He was not worried that Bhishma and all are going to kill him, because he knew he had confidence in his own capabilities. He was going to kill all these people. That is what bothered him and scared him. It's like you suddenly realize that you're going to kill your whole family. All your parents, your grandparents, your siblings, your cousins, anyone close to you, all these people you've grown up with. You're in a position now you have to kill them all. Suppose suddenly you realize that. And so he got panicky. So at that time, before Sri Krishna starts talking to him about Atma and Ishvara and creation and those kinds of things, he needed to calm him down. So he makes certain broad statements, which is all truth, not simply reassuring him, oh, everything will be okay, like we do. Anybody has any problem in front of us, they're suffering. What is the big solution? Big comfort, we say, everything will be okay, everything will be okay. Don't worry. We don't know what else to say. We know everything, never okay. Some things get better, some things don't get better. Generally, we handle things after a period of time, all those things. But we'll keep saying, oh, everything will be okay, everything will be okay. Somebody died, oh, everything will be okay, So it's reassuring though. It's true also on some level. So it's reassuring to hear. So Bhagavan says things in the beginning, because, if you notice the reason I'm saying that, he will say, person never dies. Na jayate mriyate va kadachit. Like that all he says. But then the next verses, he doesn't explain exactly what exactly how that is so. But he says those things, which are all true. But as the teaching continues, then these ideas are clarified. Okay. So some of these things require a lot of, you have to still listen, go through it. Some of these questions, these ideas are going to be clarified. What is Atma? What is Jiva? What is the one that travels? What is the one that, what is dying? What is death? What does it mean when you say not dying? These are all terms that have to be understood. Is the body dead or not? What do you mean by dead? The person was sleeping, his body is there. You say the person is dead, his body is still there. So from the body standpoint, what do you mean when you say is the body dead or is the person dead? No. From the body standpoint also you can say death. Means when there is no consciousness in it. It is just matter. But from the person standpoint, what does it mean? It means that something that was inside the body is not there, but the body is still there. So from that standpoint, it is separation. There is a separation between something that was there or something that is not there now. Whereas from the body standpoint, it's the same, it's there. So what I mean is there are all these concepts are there which are going to be clarified. So I think let's suspend some of these questions because they are going to be addressed as you go further into the chapters, But one thing I thought which is important to know is knowing the meaning of words. You know, when when the scripture uses words like jiva, like atma, like mind and buddhi and intellect and senses and all that, what exactly does it mean? You know, like a glossary of computer terms or emojis, you know. So I sent a small book. It's called Tattva Bodha. Basically, it's a book of, it's not very big, but it defines all these words, the way it is used in our scriptures, you know. So I just mailed it to her last night in a PDF format. So I'm going to request her to mail it to all of you, email it to all of you. Please try and go through that, you know, read that. It's there in uh, Sanskrit, Devanagiri, also in Hindi, meaning is there, and in English also meaning is there. So either way, you can just read the English part of it if you can't read the others. But please just review that, you know, because these words, as you can see, it's important to know exactly what is meant contextually or in the scripture, what we mean. Then some of these questions also will be answered. Otherwise, just the some statements are there, but whenever you see statements like that which are not explained fully, they are going to be explained as you go through the further verses. You know? So I think I'll stop with this now for the moment. If you want few minutes, I know it's very late for you guys, but 5 minutes or 10 minutes. If you have any particular questions, we can address that.